Hey guys, this is Mr. Thomas. I want to give you some introductory information about the first chapter in the course, chapter 1, which is just called the human organism. This is a very introductory chapter. It's going to go through just some general information that'll try to help you, not just for this chapter, but for many of the chapters that we cover throughout the semester. And so, of course, the very first thing to look at is some definitions for the terms anatomy and physiology. By the way, early on in the semester, you should find some way to learn vocabulary. If you want to be something that'll try to help you a lot in the class is to learn and to understand vocabulary. A lot of students still use flashcards. You can either do that through something online like the Quizlet, or you can just get some flashcard index cards, make your own flashcards, find some way to learn vocabulary, and that will help you a lot throughout the chapter. So here you have the vocabulary starting out for anatomy, physiology. Anatomy you can think of as the structure, the different structures, and so we're going to look at anatomy throughout the different body systems through the semester. And then physiology is how those structures function. And so we'll be looking at that as well. You can also look at cell physiology. We'll do a little bit of that, and that's just looking at the function of the cell on a cellular level, how organelles work inside of the cell. And so we'll see a little bit of that as well. This little slide just kind of shows, some important things about anatomy and physiology, because it's able, by studying this topic, you're able to understand a little bit more about how the body works and how the body responds to various stimuli that could be internal stimuli, things that cause a change inside the body or from outside the body. It could be how things in the environment cause some changes in the body. More importantly, we'll be looking at diseases and how some diseases affect different organs and different body systems, as well as some injuries as well. Now, there's different ways that you can study anatomy, and so we will be taking basically a systemic approach. That's the first one listed here for you, which is just going to go through the different body systems one by one, step by step. And so we'll start out and looking at some basic introductory terms, and then we'll move on to each of the different 11 major body systems. You can study regional anatomy, although that's usually reserved for medical schools, medical colleges. You can study some surface anatomy, and you can also look at X-rays, ultrasound, MRIs, different scanning technologies that look at imaging as far as a study of anatomy. Now, one thing that this introductory chapter does is to look at the organism in 6 different levels, and we'll be from time to time looking at all 6 of these levels. And so this is listed out the first 2. There's 6 of these. Lists the first 2 from smallest to largest, and so the smallest part that we'll see from time to time is the chemical level. Chemicals affect the body in many different ways, and so it's good to understand a little bit of chemistry as you go through the course. And so so the chemistry is the smallest level here of the organism, and then you build up to the cellular level. And so some of these we'll see in another chapter. So examples of different organelles or small organs inside of the cells, such as the mitochondria. You may remember, if you've had some high school biology, mitochondria is where most of the ATP energy is produced in a cell. And also the nucleus, and that contains your genetic information, your DNA and your RNA. Then if you move up from that, you have tissues. So we're getting larger as we go through this hierarchy. We're getting larger and larger. And so 3 would be tissues, and there's 4 major types of tissues in the body, and we'll be covering these in a whole nother chapter. So if you don't get these right away, that's okay. There's a whole chapter that deals with each of these tissues that are listed here: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue. Then if you move up from that, tissues kind of come together to create what we call an organ. And they list out some of the organs, common organs here for you, like the stomach and the heart and liver, the ovaries, bladder, kidneys. These are all examples of organs. And in the little picture here, the little diagram, they give you an example of the bladder, the urinary bladder. they show a little cross section here showing you that this organ is made out of different types of tissues. And so you'll find some epithelial tissue that lines the inside of that organ. You'll find some connective tissue there. You'll find some muscle tissue that's part of it. And then some more connective tissue here on the outside. So you've got, the definition here for the organ is that you've got at least 2 different types of tissues, sometimes more, that are working together in a central location to kind of perform some kind of function. Build up from organs, you have number 5, organ system, and we'll be talking about the different organ systems. And like I said earlier, we're going to take a systemic approach and go through the human body system by system. And so once you put all of the organs together that function to a particular, that contribute to a particular function, you have an organ system. And so in the picture here, you have a kind of a picture of the organs involved in the urinary system. You have 2 kidneys, the ureter coming down from each side, going into the urinary bladder, and then the urine would be excreted out through the urethra. And so this would be one example of an organ system. Then last on the hierarchy is basically the complete organism. Once you put all of the different organ systems together, you basically build a complete organism. And so there's a few diagrams you can kind of look at. I know it's kind of hard to see from this particular slide the detail here in figure 1.3, but what it does is go through and show you just a general synopsis of each of the major organ systems in the body. And like I said, we'll have a chapter that deals with each one of these. Now this first slide shows you 6. At some point you need to go through, just kind of look at each one and look at the major parts of each of these systems, so that you're a little bit familiar with what the system name is, and also some of the main parts. Integumentary is listed here. It's basically your hair and your skin. Anything that covers the body is listed there. The skeletal system is listed here. Muscular system. Down here you have the nervous system, the endocrine system, cardiovascular, and then on the next slide you have your lymphatic system, respiratory, digestive system, the urinary system, and then male and female reproductive systems. So you have a total of 11, and then on this slide they separate out male and female reproductive systems. So at some point kind of go through so that you have a general understanding of each of the main systems, but like I said, we'll go through each one in a separate chapter. Now the next little section kind of briefly talks about some characteristics of living organisms. There are several characteristics of all living organisms, so we'll kind of go through these kind of quickly. First one here is organization. Living organisms are organized, and so they have all the different systems, just like we talked about. The hierarchy is there, so you have a lot of order and organization between the different anatomical structures and functions. All living organisms have metabolism, and we'll have a chapter that talks more about metabolism. There's your definition listed there for you. It is, if you put together all the different chemical reactions in the body, that's a definition of metabolism. Sum of all chemical and physical changes sustaining an organism. That is one way to define metabolism. And another way to kind of define it is looking at the energy use that's required by the body, and so we'll be talking about that in another chapter as well. Responsiveness, that's number 3, the ability to respond to sense, to detect, and to respond to different changes in the environment. All living organisms have that ability. And then you have 3 others here: growth, development, and reproduction. All living organisms grow. They have the ability to increase in size. That's comes in different ways. That means that you increase the size of the cell. The cell actually gets larger. You can have more cells. You have groups of cells forming. And then you also have extracellular materials, things on the outside of the cell. A lot of times that's proteins or different body fluids that's there, and so that's all part of growth. That's different than development. Development means that not only are you growing, but you are maturing, and so cells will go through maturing phase, and that changes the cell from being more generalized to being more specialized, and that's given a special term there, differentiation. And so we'll talk a little bit about some cell differentiation, especially when we get to the reproductive system. Then the last one is reproduction. All living organisms must be able to reproduce, and so the definition there is formation of new cells or new organisms. There are different types of cell reproduction. We'll look at that later. And of course, that also includes the generation of new individuals, and that's the function of the reproductive system. But you can also include tissue repair here, because you're basically reproducing new cells whenever you have an injury, and those cells regrow, and so you have tissue repair there as well. Now, the next major term that you need to get to know is a term called homeostasis. Make sure you make a flashcard on this and try to understand homeostasis. One simple way to memorize this is to realize this is an example of equilibrium. Trying to keep things in balance is homeostasis. And this is an ongoing process with all the different body systems, has some part of homeostasis. And so there's your kind of your book definition listed there for you. The maintenance of constant internal environment despite fluctuations in the external or internal environment. So your body is trying to maintain kind of an equilibrium. And so we'll talk about some examples in just a minute. There are some variables that take place. And so there's many different variables that could cause a change in some condition. Different conditions are listed here. This is just, some examples. Your body temperature is always fluctuating. You probably realize your body temperature is about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 37 degrees Celsius. But that's always fluctuating, even on a daily basis. It kind of changes a little bit. Your heart rate, that changes. Your blood pressure, that should be somewhere around 120/80, maybe a little lower than that would be even better. And so your blood pressure is always changing up and down a little bit. Glucose levels in the blood, the different blood cell counts inside of your blood, your respiration rate, that changes as well. So these are all different types of variables or measurements that can change based on your conditions. Now, there's a couple terms that apply to homeostasis or keeping that balance. One is your normal range. And so that normal range and a set point, I want to show you the set point first. If you look at the picture here, this is figure 1.4, maps out homeostasis for you, and they give you the example variable as body temperature. It turns out that your brain, your hypothalamus in your brain sets your body temperature, and like I said, it's usually set about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and so that's the set point. But then you kind of have a normal range that kind of goes up and down. You have a normal range that increases and decreases right around that set point. And if it gets too far out of range, then you're out of homeostasis, and so your body's going to try to implement something to try to bring you back down closer to the set point. Or if you start going too far below the set point, something will start happening hopefully in your body that's going to increase you back up so you can get back to that set point. This slide just kind of gives you some more examples. Set points for some variables can be temporarily adjusted depending on body activity. So some of these are just, like I said, just normally going to be varying around that set point. So, body temperature obviously can go up because of a fever. And that's just a part of your immune system. Your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiratory rate, that normally can increase because of exercise. So there's some normal type of body activities that can cause changes in some of these variables. Now, there are two feedback mechanisms we need to talk about that affect homeostasis. The first one is negative feedback. Negative feedback tries to limit how far away from the set point you actually get. And so a lot of students see it called negative and think that it's a bad system, but it's not negative in that regard. Negative just means that you're trying to minimize how far away from the set point you really are. So negative feedback response involves detection, a deviation away from the set point, and then some type of correction to try to get you closer back to the set point. And so there's feedback mechanisms have different types of some vocabulary that kind of goes along with this. First of all, in order to have some type of feedback mechanism, you've got to have some way to detect that there's really a change. So if you go back and think about your body temperature example, the variable in that example is your body temperature, 98.6. Well, something has to, you have to have a receptor to be able to determine, what that change is. And so again, your brain can detect whether or not your body temperature is changing or not. Then you have some kind of control center, and that's usually your nervous system or your brain as well, and that receives some information, and that's what also establishes the set point. So like I said earlier, your hypothalamus is kind of your temperature control center of the brain. It sets the body temperature, and then it controls the set point. It controls and detects the receptor information, and it can send a signal out to make changes if it needs to. If the brain detects it needs to make changes to the variable, in this case body temperature, it can send a signal to the effector. The effector is what's going to cause some kind of change in that variable. So let's say your body temperature is starting to go down. What's a normal, if you think about this, what's a normal way that your body can respond if your body temperature starts to drop? Well, one thing it can do is to start to shiver. You can have involuntary muscle contractions that cause your body to shiver, your muscles to contract, almost spasm, and that increases your body temperature. Here's a little diagram that's kind of showing you a homeostasis mechanism. This is also looking at temperature. And so here you have number one, this is looking at the skin. Number one, receptors in the skin can monitor body temperature. That sends information over to the spinal cord, the control center, the brain area, through the spinal cord and then into the base of the spinal cord, the brain area here. And then that sends information back over to the skin. So that's now the effector. And if body temperature is going up, if that's the scenario, the body temperature is going higher than 98.6 and it's being detected by the skin, then you're outside of the set point range. You need to cool the body back off. And so to do that, this is sending information over to the sweat glands to release sweat onto the surface, and hopefully that'll cause your body to cool down. There's some other examples. You can kind of look through figure 1.6 and look at some other examples based on that as well. And then the second example of feedback is positive feedback. Positive feedback is different than negative feedback because in this case, you're moving further away from the set point. Remember, negative feedback, you're trying to get closer and closer back to that set point. You're trying to keep back in range, but positive feedback means you actually go outside of the range. You're going further away from the set point. Definition mechanisms occur when the initial stimulus further stimulates the response. And so the system response causes a progressive deviation away from the set point. It goes outside the normal range. So in other words, that's not really homeostasis because you're not trying to keep an equilibrium. It's actually going further away. But that can be a normal process as well. The example here is childbirth. So let me see if there's a diagram. Let's see. For childbirth, if you think about as a baby is being delivered, as it's getting ready to be delivered, is pushing down into the lower section of the uterus called the cervix. That's going to push on the smooth muscle around that cervix area that causes uterine contractions. Well, the uterus, when it contracts, it opens up the cervix a little bit more, and that allows the baby to push a little further down into the birth canal, and then that process repeats itself. And so that's a positive type of a feedback loop. Most of the time you don't see positive feedback mechanisms very often, but sometimes they can be associated with injury or disease or loss of blood. If you have an injury that causes severe blood loss, that could have a positive feedback loop that's actually detrimental to the body. You can, but most of the time you'll see negative feedback loops in place to try to fix some type of a problem in the body. This example tries to illustrate or compare negative and positive feedback mechanisms. And they're showing you that you have, some type of, starting on side A here, you've got a negative feedback example. You've got some type of substrate, some type of chemical reaction that's going to eventually make some kind of product. And you start out with a particular enzyme, and that makes an intermediate reaction, chemical here, and you've got another enzyme here. And then when you make enough of the active product, it will actually cause a negative feedback to slow down enzyme A, to slow down this pathway. So if you're trying to go from the substrate down to this product, and you require these enzymes to work, once you have enough product made, you need to slow down or stop this reaction. Well, by having enough of the active product available, then it actually creates a negative feedback loop that will block this enzyme and thereby slowing down the production of this active product. For positive feedback, instead of slowing down the enzyme, it actually adds more to it. And so by taking the substrate through that same process, you have the active product here, and by the presence of this active product, that actually stimulates more enzyme, which means you can now have a more product form. So again, negative feedback gets you it's kind of a thermostat type of example. It gets you closer to homeostasis, closer to the set point. Positive feedback gets you further away. Now, the other main section in chapter 1, and again, this is just a lot of terminology, but you need to know this, this vocabulary to help you, not just in this chapter, but in all the different chapters that we look at. And so early on, try to learn a lot of these definitions, so that'll help you throughout the course. The first one here is anatomical position. And so there's a definition here for you for anatomical position, and then we're going to talk about different terms that describe the body's position, and that can be used to talk about the body's position, that always use anatomical position as a reference point. So here's your definition. Make sure you understand this. A person in anatomical position, a person will be standing erect, standing up, with their face and palms facing forward. Just like in the diagram, this person is standing up, and she's front facing, and her hands and her palms are facing forward. And so as you see on the diagram, we'll talk about these briefly, but as you see on the diagram, there's different terms associated with body positions, but they are all based on, they all have the same reference point, is that person is in anatomical position. So let's look at some of these what are called directional terms. Superior means above. And so if you're comparing two different structures, superior means above. Inferior means below. And so if you look, let's look back at the picture here. In anatomical position, the nose would be superior to the mouth, right? Because the nose is above the mouth. The mouth is inferior to the nose. And so that's how you would be describing these. Remember, this is always in anatomical position. And so even if a person is not in anatomical position, these terms still use that as a reference point. In other words, if this person was standing, if this woman right here was standing upside down, if she was upside down, her nose is still towards the head. Her nose would still, even if she's upside down, her nose is still more superior than her mouth is. And her mouth would be inferior to her nose, regardless of how she is, because these terms only work in anatomical position. Anterior, posterior. Anterior is towards the front of the body, posterior is toward the back. Sometimes you see the words ventral and dorsal, mainly in four-legged animals. You may see ventral. That's the same thing as anterior. Dorsal is the same thing as posterior. Several terms on this slide. Medial is closer to the midline of the body. You have an imaginary line that basically divides the body into equal left and right halves. And so medial is something that's closer into the midline of the body. Lateral is something that's further away out from the midline of the body. So the hips would be lateral to the navel region, or the navel would be medial to the hips. Proximal and distal. Proximal is the point closest, something that's closer to the point of attachment. Usually you see these used in the appendages, in the limbs. So you'll see these used in the arms and in the legs. And then distal is something that's further away from the point of attachment. So the ankle is distal to the knee. The ankle is further away from the knee. Or the hip joint is proximal to the knee because the hip is closer to the point of attachment than the knee is. The hip would be proximal to the ankle would be distal to the hip. However you want to, you can use those terms to describe locations in the arms and the legs. Superficial and deep is something that's closer to the surface than it's superficial. Something is further into the interior of the body than it's considered to be deep. And so you could say something like the skin is superficial to the muscles, or the muscle layer is deep to the skin layer. You see some other diagrams. Like I said, find some way to memorize these, practice these. We're going to have a lab exercise eventually that will help you to practice these terms. The other thing here is body planes. And so these are especially important if you are going into radiography and sonography. You'll see different planes of imaging. And so these are good terms to memorize as well. Sagittal plane is the plane that's going to divide the body into left and right parts. You can see that through, this is a vertical plane here, and it's dividing the body left and right. Median plane is a sagittal plane along the midline. Not all sagittal planes have to be right through the midpoint. A sagittal plane is always going to divide left and right, but it doesn't have to be equal. But if it is equal, then it's referred to as a median plane. Sometimes you see median plane referred to as a mid-sagittal plane. Transverse, notice the transverse is going perpendicular to the sagittal plane. And so this is going across the body. This could be anywhere. They put it right around the navel region, but you can have a transverse plane anywhere throughout the body. And notice that it's separating superior and inferior. And then a frontal plane is one that is separating the body from an anterior and posterior parts. You can also have a plane that's sectioning through an organ, and you can kind of see here, this is a section of the intestines, and they've sectioned a longitudinal section, which is a lengthwise section. And then they show you what, after you make a section through that, what it would look like. If you were to look at it, it would kind of look like a long oval here. And then you can have a transverse, which is at a 90 degree to the main section of the organ. A 90-degree section makes a transverse or a cross section. And then something other than a 90 degree, maybe a 45-degree angle, creates an oblique section. Now, let's a couple things we'll look at. You have different body regions, and so go through and kind of study some of the vocabulary words associated with different body regions. And again, we'll see these used throughout the course. Upper limbs, the upper arm, forearm, wrist, and hand in that order. Lower limbs, the thigh, the lower leg, the ankle, and the foot. And then the central regions, the head, the neck, and then the trunk or torso. And then this picture kind of shows you not just the regions, but also individual regions within those areas. So, for example, the head, the frontal region is here. It's called the forehead. The frontal region, the orbital region is where the eyes are located. The nasal region is for the nose. The oral region is for the mouth. Most of you are probably familiar with those terms already. Cervical region is the neck. So these terms are your anatomical terms. The ones in parentheses are referred to as common terms. And so make sure you go through and memorize the anatomical terms for these areas. You'll see these again throughout the chapter when we get to the bone anatomy, the muscle anatomy. Many of these are used over there as well. And then this diagram shows you many of the terms that are associated with the posterior section of the body. Then this next couple sections looks at ways that you can look at the abdominal cavity. What they did was, if you just look at the abdominal cavity here, you can separate this into quadrants, which means 4. So 4 sections. You can divide the abdominal cavity into 4 main sections. And so you have the left upper, right lower, and left lower. By the way, I forgot to mention earlier when we were looking at directional terms, make sure that you realize that this is the left side of the body, and this is the right side of the body. We're accustomed to saying that over here will be right, but remember, these are directional terms. They use anatomical position, and so you're talking about the diagram's left side, which is here, or your patient's left side, which would be here, not your right, not your left side, the patient or the diagram's left side, which is on this side. So this is your left upper quadrant, your right upper quadrant, right lower, left lower. Then sometimes they subdivide these into actually 9 sections, which are listed here. You have the left and right hypochondriac region, which just means below the rib cage, right around the rib cage. You have the left and right lumbar region, which means lower back region, and left and right iliac region, which refers to the iliac bone, which is part of your pelvis. The umbilical region is right in the middle. Hypogastric, which means below the stomach region, and epigastric, which means above the stomach region or the digestive region, is listed there. Last couple of things we'll look at, the body cavities. There's several main body cavities. We've mentioned already the abdominal cavity here, but here you see the thoracic cavity being outlined here. That's your chest cavity. And that's where you're going to find your heart, lungs, even your thymus gland, which on this diagram is located right here, is the thymus gland. You can see the heart here. You can see, you can't really see it, but a part of it is here. The trachea is going to extend right through here. So there's the trachea, and then just deep to the trachea, you would find the esophagus. Also, there's a term here called mediastinum. That's a good term to add to your vocabulary list. Mediastinum means this middle section of the thoracic cavity, right there in the middle. Right in the middle of the lungs would be the mediastinum region, and that's where you're going to find the heart, the thymus gland, some major blood vessels. The aorta comes out there, and also your trachea and esophagus is here. Also notice this line here is your diaphragm. That diaphragm is the muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And so abdominal cavity is listed here for you. Sometimes this is considered to be the abdominopelvic. Sometimes you'll see this just abdominal and then this as pelvic. So you can either include these together as abdominopelvic, or you can separate these into 2 separate cavities. The abdominal cavity is going to have your major digestive system organs such as the stomach, intestines, liver, and then some accessory organs like the pancreas, urinary organs, the kidneys, and an immune system organ we'll talk about later, the spleen. The pelvic cavity has the urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and then a little bit of the large intestines, rectum. It's going to be down through here in the pelvic region. All right. We need to talk briefly about membranes. This is something that we'll also see throughout the chapter, but membranes help to line those various cavities and also help to cover different organs and help to protect those organs. And so there's a little terminology that's associated with these membranes. These are called serous membranes because they produce a little bit of fluid called serous fluid that's there basically to protect the organ or to line the cavity. The way the terminology works is that these serous membranes have 2 layers. You have a visceral layer and you have a parietal layer. The visceral layer comes in contact with the organ. It actually touches the organ. So what the book does is give you a little diagram Say, for example, if you were to take a balloon, if you could kind of push your fist up to that balloon, then you would see you'd have two layers of that balloon. The layer that comes in contact with your hand would be analogous to the visceral layer. Comes in contact with the organ, so that's the inner layer, that's the visceral layer, and what's on the outside of that balloon would be the parietal layer. Parietal here comes from the same word. You have perimeter, and so this just means the outer layer. And then in between the visceral and parietal area layers, you would have a cavity, a very thin cavity, and you would have a little bit of a serous fluid inside of that cavity. And again, that creates a kind of a cushion, a little bit of a protective layer. So this slide here kind of gives you some examples of serous membranes and where they're found. You have a serous membrane known as the pericardium, and you can probably imagine and realize that this is around the heart, because cardio refers to heart, peri means going around, so pericardium goes around the heart, and it's part of, and it includes a pericardial cavity between those two layers. The pleura is the serous membrane that goes around the lungs, and it has a cavity inside of those serous membranes known as the pleural cavity. The peritoneum goes around most of the abdominal organs, so it's in the abdominopelvic region or cavity. So this kind of explores a little bit more of the pericardium. You can see the diagram here of the heart, and the innermost layer contacting the heart is the visceral. It's kind of outlined in red, the visceral pericardium. The parietal pericardium is on the outside layer of the heart, and then you've got a little bit of fluid on the inside of that cavity. Same type of scenario with the lungs. The little red line here indicates the visceral pleura going around the and actually touching the organ, and so that's the inner layer. You've got the parietal layer going on the outside of the lung, and then you've got a little bit of a cavity space there that will contain a little bit of serous fluid. Same example here for the peritoneum in the abdominopelvic cavity, same type of scenario. The only difference here is that some of the organs, such as the kidneys, let's look at the posterior side over here, such as the kidneys, are what are known as retroperitoneal, because they're not part of that particular serous membrane. They have a separate membrane layer, and so they're not part of the peritoneum, so they're referred to as retroperitoneal organs. All right, I know that's a very quick walkthrough of the chapter, but hopefully you'll see that this first chapter is mainly learning some vocabulary that will help you, not just in this chapter, but also in future chapters.